But I like to think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about for the next hour is very portable information. It's something that I hope that everyone on the call today will take with them throughout their careers. And I think a lot of what I say is really adaptable and meaningful for all social science research in all disciplines everywhere. So that's our goal for today. And so I would say that about 30% of what I want to talk about will give you an overview, some theoretical grounding, and kind of explain where this idea of gender inclusivity came about when it comes to participatory research. And then I would like for maybe 70% of our time to deal with what does this mean for what you're doing in the field? So unfortunately, I think a lot of gender trainings, they tell you about, gender equality and equity and why this is important. But if the reality is, if you're already on this call, you're already very aware of gender. And so what I want is for you to hopefully leave this call and be visualizing what you're going to do with this when you're actually in the field doing research. So that's my goal. So this is very action focused, I would hope. So as a brief overview, my name is Dr. Laine Munir, and I wear a couple hats in Rwanda. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center of Excellence of Biodiversity at the University of Rwanda, and I'm lucky enough to work with Beth Kaplan, and that's my primary hat today. As an aside, I also am a professor of global challenges at African Leadership University, and I'm also a gender consultant for NGOs who are doing internal gender auditing, and I do gender consulting for research for NGOs to see if their programs are working. So I've worked with universities and NGOs, but my thing is always gender inclusivity. So this is my wheelhouse. Okay, so really quickly, in hopefully 2 minutes, people who don't have a background in gender, I just want to bring them up to speed and answer the question of why are we talking about this? So really briefly, 100-year summary of the social sciences is that I would say maybe even up to 30 years ago, social scientists, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, anyone who looked at social phenomenon was still talking about their research subjects. And that is a term that you still hear a lot in especially public health and medical research and what I would call the hard scientists. But there became this, I guess, identity crisis in the social sciences several decades ago, in which there was this idea that it's not helpful, it's not good for science, and it's not good for people in communities that we study to call them subjects, because that takes away their agency. That makes, people are not objects to be examined. We like to think about the idea that the communities that we work with, we have research participants, and it takes away this hierarchy between the researcher and the person being studied. And the goal of saying research participants is to equal it out and to make an effort to ensure that the people that we study are actually, they have loud voices, they have clear voices, and they are helping to shape our research. We are not the leaders and they are not the subjects. They help us to have a discussion. So the goal is to think of research as having a horizontal discussion between the researcher and the participant. And this is extremely important during international research when you have European researchers and American researchers and white researchers who are collaborating with people of color and people in Africa and people in post-colonies, right? Because we want to have a level playing field among everyone involved. So that's really the goal, is equality within the research team and between the team and participants. And so the goal is also, there's also maybe 20 years ago, there was this idea that social science should do good things in the community that it studies. And there was this movement for a lot of researchers, that this idea that we're not just trying to find scientific truth, but we're trying to make communities better. And the best way to make them better is to listen to people who are in those communities, right? So this idea is that we want to do social good and we want to empower the people to have a better life because we studied them. So then the main argument for gender mainstreaming in research is that, number one, for hundreds of years, most research was male dominated and it left women out. So then maybe in like the 1970s, there was this argument that therefore we should make research neutral. But of course, very quickly, within 10 years, we had the argument that gender neutral research is not neutral at all. By ignoring gender differences, you're actually just reinforcing gender hierarchy. And the same can be said for race in research too. So then after that, people said, no, neutral isn't neutral. It reinforces dominance. We need to have gender responsive or gender inclusive research models that account for power and resource inequity. And so that's kind of the model that we work with on today. And it's so rad because, one, it's a model of doing good for your in the communities. And number two, it's really helpful for interdisciplinary research, which is what we're doing, right? On this project, we have biologists and we have botanists and we have political scientists and we have environmental researchers. So inclusivity is so important for interdisciplinarity because it's really too easy for one of those disciplines to dominate and maybe not fully account for what I would call the gender dynamics or those kind of like unclear, non-quantitative dynamics that we want to capture in the CC19 project. And most relevant in 2021 is this is just a general finding across the globe in development studies that COVID-19 is exacerbating gender inequalities, period. It's exacerbating income inequality and unfair domestic labor, and it's even raising rates of domestic violence in a lot of countries and things like that. And so at this moment in history of the world, it's now important more than ever to have gender inclusive approaches to research because gender inequalities are increasing because of COVID. So therefore, gender responsiveness and research needs to adapt to account for those inequalities. So it's just a really exciting time to be an inclusivity focused researcher. Michael, would you mind letting 3 people into the, if they're in the waiting room, going and letting them in for me? Thanks so much. So very briefly, gender inclusive research approaches are about not just thinking about gender equality, but thinking about gender equity. So my experience with Rwandans is that they are very conscious of the idea of gender equality because gender equality is such a part of the national agenda, and it's something, you know, gender equality gets talked about in the news and in schools and things like that. But what I want to talk about is that gender equality is about equal access, right? An example that I give to my undergraduates is that you can put a water pump at the top of a hill and it can have a sign that says men and women equal access to this water pump. No one will turn away women from using this water pump, right? And then with this diagram I draw on the board or with a cartoon, there's a man on the bottom who drives up in a car and he starts to walk up the hill to get to that water pump. But then there's a woman at the bottom of the hill and she's carrying a baby on her back and firewood on her head and she's wearing flip-flops. And of course, she can't climb the hill equal to this man of means in the cartoon I use. And so that water pump at the top of the hill is an example of gender equality. Everyone has equal access to that. But it's not an example of gender equity. Equity is about truly level means of actual resource use. So it's about access in which theoretically, nobody's blocking anyone. But equity is about actual enjoyment of resources and actual enjoyment of power and actual enjoyment of decision making. So this picture that you see on the screen right now is also an example of that. You have a tall man, maybe an adolescent child, a teenager, and then say a toddler, a small child. And each of those three figures has equality in being able to look over this wall. Let's say that there are resources on the other side of the wall that they want to identify. But equity will show us that really the shortest people in this picture, who represent those without resources, they need an extra box, they need a little boost to actually have any equity in what's available on the other side of this wall. So this relates to our research, because gender differentials and power differentials in the communities where we're going to do research mean that men and women don't have equal access to our data collection for various reasons that we'll go through. So our job as gender inclusive researchers is to make sure that we give an extra box to stand on to vulnerable populations who we want to do research with. So these extra boxes can be changing around schedules, changing locations, giving supplemental transport money, whatever, to the marginalized people that we want to do our research with. So we need to accommodate inequalities in the communities to make sure that we hear the voices of men and women, young and old, and all sorts of research participants. Gracious, I think I saw you taking notes, which is the ultimate form of flattery for anyone who's leading an online training. Okay, so really quickly, I just want to go through these concepts. If you've heard them already, awesome. If you haven't, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we are going to talk a lot today about gender roles. And in rural Africa, that has a lot to do with labor designation. And it has a lot to do with the way we construct what are women's tasks and what are men's tasks. So these are tasks, the way we spend our time in labor, that are assigned based on our gender. By the way, quick question, what is the difference between sex and gender? Anyone on the call? Open question. What's the difference between sex and gender? Female is a sex, to be a woman is a gender. You can guess if you're not certain.
Can I say something on that?
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a very tricky question. But when we talk about gender, we go beyond sex. We are looking at roles and responsibilities. How are they divided? And between men and women, between boys and girls. But we're also looking at how there is equity in terms of distribution of resources, whether at household level or whether in programming of different interventions. Sex is just a characteristic showing whether you are a girl or a boy or from the sex perspective. Thank you.
That was a great answer. And I really liked how you used the term going beyond. So we will never use the word sex unless we're doing a survey and we're trying to say whether it's a male or female. We always use the word gender because sex is about your biological designation at birth, your body parts. Gender is so much more than that. And I heard the term going beyond that. Gender is about all the things that we think people should do and believe and the ways they should behave based on their sex. So gender is much, much more complex. Gender is a social construction, sex is biological. So with that, that's what I want you to remember every time you hear the word gender. So access is about the availability of resources, services, facilities, knowledge, skills that can actually be used. So that's what I meant when I talked about that water pump analogy, right? About what can be used versus what's just there. Control. So really quickly, in political science, we define power. It was defined by this German social scientist named Max Weber. Power is the ability to make people behave in ways they otherwise would not have behaved. So think about this I mean, this is like something you should think about like throughout your life. Power is the way to make others behave in a way they would not have otherwise behaved. So that's what we mean when we talk about power. So power and control get used interchangeably. So power control is the capacity to influence decisions and actions. Equality is that idea that men and women have equal rights, responsibilities, opportunities, often on paper. So you can have legal equality between men and women. It doesn't really translate into the dinner table at night within a family, right? So equality is about like the rules that are there. And then equity to me is about what actually happens. So our goal as gender inclusive, focused, participatory researchers, we want to help do equity. And we can do this without interfering with our ability as scientists, right? Because as scientists, we revere objectivity above all else. But I hope by the end of the day, you'll see that gender inclusivity helps with our scientific objectivity. By leaving women's voices out of our research, we're not really like being neutral. We're compromising the scientific truth that we're hoping to achieve, right? So that's what we want to think about when we think about like equity in our research. So, okay, so if you got a bunch of gender inclusive researchers nerding out in a room together, these are the things that we would never have to say out loud because we already agree on them. So these are like accepted social truths among inclusivity researchers, but I wanted to put them out because obviously everyone in this room has different backgrounds. So if you got a bunch of us together in a room, we would agree, number one, that power structures and all forms of inequality, not just gender, but all forms of inequality, are often perceived as normal. So no one wonders why women spend more time doing unpaid childcare than men, but we should. Nobody wonders why men have to travel farther away from home to earn cash for their families, but maybe we should. So number one is that gender inequality is constructed as normal with the myth that it's based on sex, but it really doesn't need to be and it shouldn't be. The second agreement among us is that gender changes over time. Rwanda's and Malawi, I guess Malawi too, I don't know as much about Malawi. Rwanda's a great example. I mean, gender equality is written into national legislation and it wasn't a generation ago. That's an example of gender changes over time. The third is that most gender inequality is based on the inequality in labor, right? So in rural Africa, women carrying water, children carrying water is much a seed of differences in income and time between men and women, right? So men doing activities for cash and women doing activities that just bring food into the home immediately is a seed for inequality. So we want to think about gender division of labor as really being kind of like the root cause of a lot of imbalances that we'll see in the field. And last thing, I think it's really important, in most social science research, we find gender imbalances in every single country on the planet always. Now, those imbalances are obviously less in, say, Scandinavian countries, but there's no country that doesn't have gender imbalance anywhere. So, and the last one is what we've already been talking about, equality versus actual equity. So at the end of the slide, we'll do questions and comments. So for us, really briefly, moving forward in CC19 and hopefully in all of your research all the time, what we don't want to do is do a bunch of research, collect a lot of data, and then write a paragraph or a page about what this means for women. That is not gender mainstreaming. That is not inclusive research. That is people trying to check a box so that they can say that their research includes women. So number one, gender is not accounted for in our analysis. Gender is accounted for from the very beginning of research planning and during data collection throughout. So it is an essential component. I don't like the term gender lens or gender sensitivity because it makes it seem like gender is something you think about afterwards, and that's not what we want. And really, my main lesson is that even if you're not a gender inclusive researcher, being gender neutral or gender blind makes for bad science. It makes for bad outcomes. So we want to improve our scientific outcomes with gender inclusivity. So any questions, comments on anything I've said so far? Have I been talking too quickly? If I talk too fast, let me know. Any clarification I can give right now. I just want to make sure we're on the same page before we move on.
Hey, Laine, this is Sandrine. I have a question about what you said about that gender changes over time. So, and you gave an example of how like it didn't exist in the Constitution of Rwanda, but now it exists. So I want you to clarify. I was wondering, is it gender that changes over time, or is it our perspective toward gender that changes over time?
My answer to you is gender roles are a reflection of our perspectives on gender roles. So if we view gender a certain way, that's our perception, it influences our behaviors. And then our behaviors create social phenomenon actions. And then we as humans look at those actions and it informs our perceptions. And then we have this cycle of like perceptions and beliefs influence actions, actions create events, and then we view those events in certain ways. So the deal with gender equality is that you want to stop this feedback loop. We want to create the sort of research that's so analytical and so self-reflective that it makes us stop and question perceptions and the readers of our research, right? We want to create research that makes people question their perceptions about gender. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. That's like honestly a really philosophical question. And there are a million books written about your very question. So that was good. Okay, any other questions? I'm on full screen mode right now, so I can't see the comments at the moment. So Beth or Michael, if I miss a question, please butt in and let me know, because I don't want anyone to be forgotten just because they can't access their audio.
You're good for now.
Okay, cool, thanks. So really quickly, we're not gonna read all through this. Really briefly, if anyone ever asks you as a researcher, so what's your gender framework for the CC19 project? Your answer is really simple. We draw from something called the Mosier framework. Don't worry about it, don't Google it. For the purposes of this project, the Mosier framework was developed, I think, in the 80s, but it was more for doing research on NGOs and policy, and for helping improve like NGO and international organization services. Like, so the Mosier framework was developed to make sure that women were accounted for in public health clinics, and that women were accounted for during food aid distribution and all those things. So it's a little bit more policy oriented than we are, because we're academic researchers. But there's three things the Mosier framework does really well. And these are the three things that we're going to take into the CC19 project. One, whenever you think about gender and equity, when you're doing your research for CC19, you think about resources. So you think about who has access to resources, who can use resources, and who controls resources. So for our purposes, resources are going to be land, they're going to be potable water, they're going to be food, they're going to be livestock, they're going to be cars and forms of transportation, they're going to be cash, they're going to be education, like school fees, books, things that allow people to have a certain level of education. You can also think about this is actually related to the third bullet point. You can think about a resource as someone's social standing in your community. So a woman who's the wife of a local leader is going to have different resources, not even financial, economic, like tangible resources, different social resources than a woman who's raising her children in a single-headed household. So think about resources. You can think about money and tangible resources that you can touch, but you can also think about resources in terms of like social or hypothetical ones as well. So the second thing that's going to determine gender imbalances in the communities where we worked is the division of labor, which we've already talked about. And on one of these slides, we're going to brainstorm together what division of labor means in Rwandan, Malawian communities. Everyone already knows this. I think they probably just never talked about it. And for our purposes, this is extremely important to studying climate resiliency because men and women interact with the environment in such different ways, right? Women do the farming close to home for like subsistence of the family. Men engage with land that in ways they often work farther away from home. Their engagement with the land has to do with like selling it for cash crops in a marketplace and things like that. So division of labor is very important for studying climate resiliency. And then last, this is actually what my research is based on, is about participation and decision making. So when we go into these communities and we're trying to better understand climate resiliency, we want to really see what are the degrees to which men and women make decisions about how land is used. How do men and women make decisions about how the community should collectively adapt to climate change? If there is a community meeting about, you know, an NGO that's doing activities nearby, what's the difference in how often men and women are talking at this meeting in which they're supposed to make a decision? What's the difference in how long men and women, the duration of how men and women speaking, and are men and women voting at the same rates? Like who is the council of elites who ends up like implementing these decisions? So that's the kind of things that we're gonna end up looking at, because that's really how climate resiliency in our communities, it's never one person acting on their own in response. Oftentimes it's a collective decision. So we have to look at men and women within that collective. So real quickly, resources, labor, decisions. Resources, labor, decisions, resources, labor, decisions. So for the Rwandan or Malawians who are on the call, so what is an example? I mean, you already know this because you're Rwandan or Malawian. What is an example of the differences in men and women in access to resources in the communities where we're going to do our research? You can just hypothesize, forecast. Anyone, open question. The Africans on the call know this way better than me. You're the experts. I have to learn from you.
Okay, can I say something?
Please.
Yeah, so the that you have is what is the, did you ask about the differences in terms of access to resources?
In access to resources between men and women. Mm-hmm.
In the villages where we're likely going to work?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, so like where we're going to work, one of the challenges that is likely to be there is that generally men have got control over land, for example.
Perfect.
And
absolutely.
anything that is on land.
And to buttress Simon's point, in Rwanda, Rwanda is actually the only country on earth that has pretty much equal land ownership between men and women, because I believe it's a national law that wives must also be put on a land title. However, that does not translate into actual decision-making over land being equal. So ownership on paper being equal does not mean actual decision-making being equal. Good example, Simon. In terms of labor, an imbalance in the sexual division of labor, examples from the communities where we're working.
So let me say something also.
Sure.
Yeah, here we see that many people who are working, they are males than females. So the government is trying its best to limit the gap, but it seems like there's much needed to be done actually. So the gap between the males and the females who are working, it's very big. It's very huge.
And specifically in the communities where we're working, Gracious, I would probably classify it as a difference in paid versus unpaid labor. For example, in rural Africa, the UN finds that the average woman spends 15 hours a week carrying water. In Saharan Africa, it's up to 25 hours a week just carrying water, not getting paid for it. And then theoretically, she doesn't get paid for childcare, she doesn't get paid for tending livestock, but men can spend that same time earning an income, right? So that is like a particular thing that we're going to face, is women having higher rates of poverty because so much of their time is doing tasks that are vital for survival, but they don't get paid for. Yeah, very good. And then relationships. Can anyone foresee what would be an example of household structures or certain relationships in the communities that we work, which might cause some women to be unequal to men or unequal to other women in the communities where we work? So how might relationship structures create vulnerability for our research participants? Because there's certain stigma for women who have certain family structures.
Okay, can I say something?
Please.
Okay, so usually in the communities, maybe women like the widows and generally women-headed households, they tend to be less considered in the issues of decision making. And probably women that are also suspected of being different from the norms of the family, like maybe they're involved maybe some kind of sex for work or something, they tend to be excluded.
So Simon, that's exactly it. And if I could take what you just said one step farther, I've done research in Nigeria, Mozambique, Rwanda, and lots of South America, which has some similar issues. Number one problem I face all the time is that I work with a local leader to try to find my female research participants. And unless it's a study about poverty, women who are married, older, and in good social standing in the community are kind of shuffled my way at a much higher rate than single mothers, widows. If it's a community that practices polyamory or having more than one wife, women of higher social standing tend to be shuffled towards me for research more than women who are more vulnerable. So that's an issue of sampling. So that's something that we're going to have to keep in mind, is making sure that when we sample women, that we're making sure that we're getting women who are maybe socially marginalized or more vulnerable. And we have to be really proactive about thinking that when we think about sampling. So last thing I'm going to say is, throughout the project, these things matter because it helps us understand how we can account for the differences in needs of our research participants' needs. And then also, this is also partially a policy research project, right? We want to know how large scale policy creates these dynamics on the ground. So we have to think about needs and policy as well. So most of us are already familiar with CCC 19's methods, but we are going to be doing direct observations. So we want to think about gender dynamics as we're taking our notes. We're going to be doing, it should be FGD, focus group discussions. We're doing interviews. We're doing surveys, and we're also doing participant self-documentation through photo voice data. So we need to take into account men and women during all of these different methods. And I'm gonna put this hypothetical question on hold, because on the next page, we're going to brainstorm. I'm trying to get you all to like kind of imagine what are some of the inclusivity challenges that we're gonna face in the field. And so now we can get to this on this slide. So we're gonna fill out this slide together. This is a participatory slide. And 1 through 10 is a list of basically, this is just from my personal experience, the challenges I have faced when trying to do gender inclusive field research in rural Africa. So this is my most important slide, and it's the participatory slide of our training today, because I want all of us to fill out the right-hand side. So here are the problems that I have encountered in trying to make sure that I have gender equitable research. Women say they're too busy to participate, or local leaders who are like my liaisons tell me that some women are too busy to participate. Women are too shy to participate. And also, especially for interviewing, that's such like an individual activity. And for communities that are so used to partnering and being in groups and doing things as a group, that can feel very alien for one female research participant to sit across from an interviewer and just talk. So being shy or not feeling empowered to participate. In some communities, I have faced husbands or male local leaders feel like they need to give women permission to participate, or women feel like they need men's participation. I've had some interviews where the husband wouldn't leave the room. So of course I couldn't include I did the interview, but I couldn't include in my results. So that's something that we might encounter. Number 4 is women giving really short answers, saying, I don't know, I think so, yes or no, and not feeling like they can or should, or they don't know how to elaborate to give really meaningful questions. And that's the interviewer's job to probe them and help them open up. Women having no transport money, or it's just too far for them to walk. Women just not showing up to focus group discussions, or not showing up to interview for a lot of reasons. Number 7 is what I mentioned before. Only women of good standing in the community are encouraged or allowed to participate. For us in particular, number 8 has to do with the photo voice part of it. So there's an element to our research that empowers participants to use technology. And I don't know if this is true, but I am foreseeing that if women have lower levels of formal education and maybe less money, they don't have experience with devices and technological sources. So I'm wondering if maybe women will either won't feel like they know how to use photo voice as well. For COVID purposes, I don't know if this is true, but theoretically, women across the world have higher rates of poverty than men. Maybe if women are more economically vulnerable, maybe they can't afford masks or hand sanitizer or PPE or whatever they need to get to us. I don't know if that's true. And then this is a common problem that I've had in a lot of communities, is local leaders who are men want to speak on behalf of the women. So like I've wanted to collect data, and the local leaders will say, oh, don't worry about that. The women's focus group discussion would have told you that they need money for seeds or whatever. So we really need to get in the habit of hearing things out of women's mouths themselves, and not allowing anyone, but especially men, to create a game of telephone in which we're having to hear what women think through men, if that makes sense. So can anyone, let's do this together. I would love to, we're gonna fill this out together. Can you think of, if you were in the field, can you tell me what a possible solution would be to any of the problems on the left? So we're gonna try to think of solutions.
Laine?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say something on the list that you have given.
Sure.
I don't know if you have come across a situation where the women simply say they are not able to speak, as in quotes, simply because of the cultural demands. Now, there are situations where, since we're going to a village where people are so related to each other, and they're operating in a situation where there are these cultural demands that, okay, if there is a daughter-in-law and the father-in-law, the daughter-in-law is not supposed to speak. That could be one of the issues that I see probably coming out.
Absolutely. And honestly, Simon, this is where I don't feel like I have as much to teach you as you have to teach me. So that's why I wanted us to fill out this slide together. For you, Simon, so what you're talking about is actually number 2, number 3, maybe number 6, number 7, and number 10. So that's a major problem is women. So what do you think is a way to solve this problem? Take it away.
Oh, sorry, I think I missed you somewhere.
Oh, no, I said your point about women not really being given the space to talk on their own. I mean, yeah. That because of cultural constructions, maybe this idea that women shouldn't be alone with a male interviewer, or women shouldn't walk alone to a research activity. So I was saying that your point is so good. It encompasses number 2 on my list. What you just said could actually be the explanation for number 2, number 3, frankly, number 4, number 6, number 7, and number 10. What I listed as those numbers could actually be what you just said.
Okay.
So for any of these, 1 through 10, can someone just give me a suggestion for if they realize this in the field, how would they solve this problem?
Okay, let me take one. Even though such issues are best solved by the researcher in the field, but on looking at number 1, such people may have good information that they may tell, but it's the creativity of the researcher, maybe to call those participants separately and ask them the questions that they are on the list. So mainly it's based on the creativity of the researcher.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So Kingston, I love your answer. I'm gonna keep you on the mic for a second. So if women are too busy to participate because it's harvesting season and they have to work in the fields from 5 a.m. until it's time for them to go home and do work, you as a researcher, what could you do if they're too busy farming? What could you do to go bridge that gap? How could you accommodate them?
Yeah, it's easy to accommodate them just because you can maybe ask them for the time where they will be free, or else you can follow them where they are and ask for a period of a short period of time whereby you can discuss with them and ask them and fulfill the task that you are there for. I think that can work.
Absolutely. So if your interview is scheduled for 8 a.m. and the women have to go farm at 8 a.m., you reschedule the interview for 5 p.m. or whenever they don't have to farm. Or I really liked your idea of geographically moving to accommodate them. If they have to farm, maybe you could go out to their crops and meet them and talk to them while they're farming. I mean, women can talk to you while they're digging, right? So change times or locations. I like that. You could even go visit them where they are. And that's an example of you bridging the gap. And what could I do if women are too shy to participate? They just say, no, thank you. So this is tricky because we would never want to force anyone to participate who doesn't want to, right? But we also want to help them feel empowered if they should want to. So 2 is really tricky because you never would want to pressure anyone. So how do we empower without pressuring?
Hello. This is Christine from Rwanda.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot for just a very concise, detailed presentation. Then what normally we do, the approach we use in this situation when women are shy, give short answers. You just first of all show them that you explain first of all the purpose clearly of your research. If they understand very well that this is not harmful, nothing as a side effect will go back to them as a response to their discussion, they will answer. Then that is number 1, explaining in details why you are going to collect the data and let them know that this is not harmful at all. Number 2, you just, at a point they give short answers, then you make sure that you probe them. At the point you probe, you say, what next? What do you think? Then you can even phrase a question in another way so that they understand. You make sure they understand clearly. Then by the time you look like you are a good friend of them, you understand them, they understand you. Just the flow of thoughts come by itself. Thank you.
That was a great answer, especially when it comes to probing. So we'll talk about probing going down, but absolutely what you said, I think if you rephrase purpose, security, having anonymous answers, things like that, that will make people feel comfortable. And then you really get the best data from people who feel comfortable and free talking to you. Another thing I want to add that I found with number 2, if people are too shy, a lot of times if you have 2 to 3 interviewers together, it's overwhelming. I found that if you can just get 1 interviewer, 1 researcher to talk on their own, that feels less overwhelming, and maybe you need to replace the interviewer who's talking. So for example, if a middle-aged man is talking to a group of women and they don't seem to be speaking, maybe if you replace that researcher or interviewer with a younger man who they see as like maybe a son, that would make them feel more comfortable. So reducing numbers and maybe substituting out who the researcher is can make a difference with how comfortable women or other vulnerable people feel. Actually, what I just said applies to a couple. So I'm gonna say change numbers or researchers. So then what about when we have this issue of men being women's conduits for speaking?
Well,
so what do we do when husbands need to give their wives permission to participate, or local leaders are speaking on behalf of women? What can we do about that? Suggestions.
I might have one.
Please.
Typically there are women support groups or finance groups where they meet to discuss, where the participants are perhaps away from husbands anyway. So rather than invite them to something new, which might stand out as being something that husbands feel they need to give permission for, you go to where women are meeting anyway to conduct a focus group.
That is probably one of the more substantive ideas I've ever come across. And it's so powerful and it's so meaningful. And this idea of I would phrase it as piggybacking or utilizing women's spaces that already exist. And it's so efficient and it's so meaningful. And I also like it because then you're also empowering women's spaces and saying that this isn't just a vegetable market. This is an important space for research because women's voices matter. So I love that suggestion. And so this really works well. I'm sorry, I don't know Malawi as well. This works really well in Rwanda because there's already all women's savings groups that typically meet once a month. There's already women's Bible study groups. There's already women's positive parenting groups. And because women tend to congregate together in particular areas of the markets because they buy and sell the same sorts of goods, there's lots of clearly women's spaces in Rwanda. So you just utilize those spaces already exist. So you just go into a researcher and try to use that gendered structure to help benefit our data collection. So fantastic activity. Women's cooperatives are particularly good in Rwanda because there's so many of them. So number 5 gets a little bit tricky because it gets messy when you're involving money and compensation in research. So what do you do when women are not coming to their research meetings with us because they say they have no transport money? This has happened in every research I've ever done ever.
Yeah, so to try on that one, what if you use the approach that you used on number 1, change locations? What if you go to them?
Absolutely. That solves the problem. And that especially solves the problem, Gracious, when it's like a pattern of not having money and lots of women are saying they don't have money. So that's hard if you're trying to do a lot of interviews. It's hard to spend, 2 hours in transport to one interviewee. But if it's a pattern, it's just efficient to go to the women. So, so I'm going to put change location. And Michael, we can cross this bridge when we come to it. I've been on some research projects where the researchers organized a shuttle because lack of transport money was such a pattern, like a problem pattern. However, you also that gets sticky because then it looks like maybe we're pushing too hard for the researchers. So Michael, you can check that out if you want to. And then there's some research projects I've been on that give supplemental transport money. So that's another option. And that's pretty common in policy and development research as well, to give each participant a little something. Michael, do we have anything already in the structure for helping pay for transport, or do we feel like we won't have transport costs for participants?
I think, well, we have a transport budget and it's up to us how we spend it, whether on our own transport or helping people to move around for us. So that's something that we can definitely discuss later. Yeah.
Don't cross that bridge when we come to it. Women miss their FGDs. This is so, it seems so obvious, but I've made the mistake of trying to figure out why my female participants didn't show up for their research meetings with me. And it's shocking how often I was dancing around it and asking local leaders or asking bus drivers or getting on Google and trying to analyze the weather. And I look back and I'm like, why didn't I just send the women a text, or why didn't I just ask them? So my response to this is call them up and ask them first, and then try to get secondary reasons afterwards. It's kind of shocking how often we don't just ask research participants, why didn't you come? So sometimes they'll give you what I think is a reasonable direct answer, but sometimes maybe if they're not proud of the reason, maybe they're embarrassed they didn't have money for transport, or maybe they're embarrassed that their husband wouldn't let them, or whatever the reason is. So if you ask them, you need to kind of read between the lines as well, because the answer might not be so direct. We're at an hour, so I'm going to try to wrap up this page. What do we do about this sampling problem? where we're not getting a true sample of all the women in the community. We're only getting socially known women, if you know what I mean. How can we get a true sampling of all sorts of women in a community? Ideas. I'm putting in my ideas too, but you can.
Yeah, so may I say something on that one?
Please.
Yeah, so
yes.
Like, I've always found it very important just to be direct, very direct with the people who are helping out to get the people that are the participants that I want to talk to, and be very clear of the people that I want to talk to.
Oh, Simon, sorry, your audio cut out. But what I got from you is that we as researchers need to be clear about the importance of talking to a variety of respondents.
Yes, and it should be something that is made very, very clear right from the beginning.
Absolutely. And I want to piggyback on that and add to schedule meetings at various times throughout the day, because it's often the case that women of a higher socioeconomic demographic can be free during the day, like specifically in the morning, and that women of perhaps more economic vulnerability, they have to get up and they have to farm right away. So changing the schedule throughout the day and even days of the week, like maybe women who are economically vulnerable have to work all day Saturday, but women who are more economically secure can take Saturdays off. So we need to even do our research on particular days of the week to accommodate these kind of like different labor roles based on income. Okay, for the last one, Michael, I'm not sure what training we have to help our respondents do the photo voice, but I am concerned about women not having the same confidence to be able to do photo voice. Michael, have you thought about this, or has this been discussed yet?
Well, what we know for now is that we will offer training to the research assistants on how to train our participants. So I think it's very important that, you know, we ensure, well, that's a good point, actually. That's all we know at this point. So that's another example where we have to probably improve. But in terms of, you mean in terms of using the technology, not having the technology, right?
Yeah, so I bring this up because I did some research in Nigeria in which I asked women to fill out, it's a long story, but to fill out this triangle on a sheet. And my experience was that the women felt uncomfortable holding a pen. They felt uncomfortable holding a pencil in a way that men didn't, because the women had lower levels of schooling and literacy. So I had to work harder to even get women to hold a pencil. And I assume that might be the case with using photo voice.
That's a good point. One thing that immediately comes to my mind, it's kind of a workaround, but it's for research assistants to video call the women and then record the conversation, essentially. So we could cut it up into clips of just the women talking. Another one would be just to train them in person when we are there in the field to show them how to do it. But these are just my immediate ideas, but yeah, we'll have to think about that more.
Okay, and I will add that, I mean, we were gonna do this anyway, but maybe with women need to be able to call or send a WhatsApp once researchers have left them, because they might need support once they've been left alone without the researcher, maybe in a way that men don't. So there probably needs to be some sort of follow-up support for people who don't have experience with devices. Just throwing that out there. Okay, and to wrap up this sheet, if women don't have masks, this is pretty easily solved, Michael, because we have money in the budget for PPE and things like this, but we just need to make sure that we give masks if needed, or give a few hundred francs for if certain people can't buy masks. And then number 10, I think actually is pretty well explained with Number 2, explaining our purposes all over again and just breaking it down. Actually, most of 10 can be answered with things we've already said. Does anyone have any particular ideas about how to ensure that, you know, community men don't try to speak on behalf of women? So if I can give you a tip, for my research in Nigeria, this was a big problem. So what I said is, for the rules of my research with my university, I have to talk to women directly, or else my research findings are not valid. And as soon as I cloaked it in terms of it being a rule, the response was very different, because the local leaders, they didn't understand why culturally they shouldn't speak on behalf of women. But as soon as I said something that was like, my boss or my university says that I must speak to women, and I framed it as a rule, and I was just the one carrying out the rule, adherence was much better. As soon as I said, my boss said it's a rule, I have to hear from women directly, there was no problem after that. So I find that just saying something's a rule makes it easier to do. So we can use everything we've already discussed about, or just talk about the rules of our research or the rules of our university, and then that's usually actually quite effective. Okay, all right, present. We'll move on to our next slide. So really quickly, as we wrap up, this is actually just something for our researchers to go back to. I just wanted to give you some ideas about supplemental ways that we can like take notes on gender. So actually, when you're in the field and you're thinking about these sort of things, one thing I love to do is draw a resource map. I love maps. I'm actually working on a book right now based on drawing maps of gender power dynamics. But you can draw a map of a community really quickly, just sketch it in your notes. If you think gender and power inequities can be drawn. So for example, is there a particular area of the community that we're studying in which women are doing one climate resiliency strategy and men are doing a different climate resilience strategy? That would be an example of a gender map that you could draw on the fly to visually represent gender dynamics in our work. Another idea is these are called gender profiles, and you can visually like represent, if you don't want to write it out in like letters and words, you can visually represent in pictures who controls what. So I assure you, when I've done this, my drawings are not this good. I'm drawing like stick figures, but this drawing is much better than my drawing. But I've done drawings to like represent crops that women control versus crops that men control versus crops that both of them control. And then I juxtapose that or compare that with the crops, because for this one study, I was only working with agriculture, the crops that men and women actually control. So use, control, ownership, things like that. So you can draw pictures to represent gender, or this is really easy. You can just take tallies on the people that you're talking to. And this is just an example of a tally labor chart, but you can have all sorts of work. It can be like who's carrying water, who is selling the crops that are most impacted by climate change. So this is just about doing tally marks, and it's just very raw, rough, unnuanced numbers, but I have found it really helpful in going back to my notes. And this is something that's best done by researchers in the field, like as they're doing data collection. So really quick summary, we're at 12 minutes after. Again, anytime you're like asking a question, I want you to think about the difference between men and women in resources, the difference between men and women in labor, and the difference between men and women in social relationships. Because those three are like the three areas are like the best way to understand gender. It is researchers like hold the keys to human knowledge in the field, and you all might have like a passing thought about gender while you're taking notes or you're doing data collection. Please write down everything, because your just passing thoughts about gender might like yield this really amazing result for the CCC 19 project. So if you even have a passing thought and you don't even think it's that special, please write it down, because those of us who are not with you like would probably never think of it. So just write down every thought about gender, no matter how silly, write it on a napkin. I don't care. I want to hear everything you think in the field, because it's all really, really interesting to me. Last but not least, like my job on this project is to help you throughout this.